Hello swim fans, my name's Carl, and today I wanted to make a video about Dryland and trying to make things a little more clear for swimmers and coaches and people interested in taking their Dryland to the next level. So a little bit about me, I'm the founder of Swim Smart, but before I was a coach I took a hiatus from swimming into the Dryland world and powerlifting. And I think the difference between me and most other strength and conditioning coaches is that I was a swimmer first who just happened to be a little above average at picking up heavy things. And when I became a coach, I wanted to bring back the concepts of the weight room and Dryland, but with a swimming focus. And I think a lot of other coaches and other strength and conditioning coaches specifically who don't have a swimming background, they kind of lose sight of why we're actually doing this, and they lose sight of the swimming aspect. So hopefully today we can bring that back. So if you haven't noticed, these days everybody and their little sister has some sort of Dryland program that they're trying to sell, or they claim that they know that they have the best Dryland program. And you know, in medicine, when there's a disease that has a really long name or it has a lot of medications that all kind of work for it, what it really means is that nobody knows exactly what's going on or how to fix it. So in these cases, I like to take a step back and just go to the fundamentals. How does the body, how does the swimming machine actually work? How is it adapting to different Dryland trainings? And if we can understand the basic concepts, then at least then we can start to structure our training in a more organized and thoughtful way. So for us, we tried to simplify things into just 4 different training types, and we'll go through all those a little bit later. And we wanted things to be as specific to swimming as possible, so almost all strokes have the same 4 swimming motions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so all of our Dryland should be based around replicating those motions. Another kind of underrated aspect of Dryland training is flexibility, and I'm going to call it training, not just stretching, because I think if we dedicated time to it, then we would actually get better at it, because I know for most swimmers it's something that we think about but never really do. And then right at the end we'll talk about a concept called periodization, which is kind of how to structure workouts and organize them. If you do zone out, here are the main concepts and the main takeaways. If you don't remember anything else, these are the most important things. First off, don't ever get hurt. Dryland is not what you're training for. You're a swimmer. There's no reason to ever go above and beyond on land if it's only going to get you hurt and injured and keep you out of the water doing what you're supposed to be doing. So keep things safe, don't overdo it, and don't get hurt. Number 2, Dryland is a supplement to swimming. It's not a replacement. I've been at swim meets where kids get out of the water after a bad race, and the first thing they tell their coach is, boy, I should have done more weights, or I should have had better Dryland. That's never the true answer. Dryland is never going to be as good for your swimming as swimming is. So always treat it as a supplement. Don't try to prioritize it. If you notice that Dryland is affecting your swimming and you're too tired to perform well in the water because of what you're doing on land, you need to rethink what you're doing on land, because the swimming part of training should always be improving and much better than the Dryland part. As we talked before, you always want to be as specific as possible in your Dryland training to what swimming motions you're doing. Once you're out of the water, you lose a lot of specificity, right? You can't swim butterfly on land, but you want to take those same motions and concepts and practice them on land. Give time for flexibility training, and if you're a coach, don't be afraid to let Dryland kind of not be as effective as you want it to be. If the kids aren't taking it all that serious and they're kind of playing around, that's not always the worst thing in the world. Remember that your goal is to build a team, and building a team is going to be much more effective for their training in the long run than anything you could do with them on land. Remember that swimmers don't really come to practice because they really like getting in cold water at 5:30 in the morning. They come to practice to be with their friends. And if you can build that kind of team atmosphere and culture during dryland where they actually have their faces out of the water and they can talk to each other, that might be the best part of the team building and dryland experience. So before we jump into all the different exercises and different training methods, how exactly is dryland supposed to help us swim faster? And I think it's always important, no matter what you study or what you do, you should always ask yourself, what's the goal here? What am I trying to achieve? So dryland for swimmers helps in a variety of ways. So number one is body awareness and control. And this is mostly for younger swimmers like 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. I'll show you a complicated picture a little bit later about why this is important. I think a lot of us have a vision of how we swim in our brains, but that's not always what's happening in the water. And being able to improve what's supposed to happen with what is happening is a real big aspect in training, especially for young swimmers. So that's more of the body awareness improvement. Another way is slightly larger muscles. So big bodybuilders generally don't make fast swimmers, so we don't want to get huge and swole in dryland, but a little bit of extra muscle mass actually kind of helps because water is so heavy. It's not like walking through the air where you can just push through with very little muscle mass. We actually, as swimmers, they kind of need a little bit of exercise. Another important aspect of dryland is actually injury prevention. Especially swimmers and other endurance athletes, they use their joints over and over so much that those joints actually become loose, and what that means is that the bones start traveling in places where they're not supposed to, and it causes injury to the ligaments and muscle tendons, and that's generally what an overuse injury is. It's usually, especially in swimming, it's caused by joints being too flexible in certain places, and dryland can help kind of stiffen those up and coordinate the muscles around the joint so that it prevents injuries in the future. And I think we've talked enough about flexibility for now. We'll get back to it a little later. But what we're going to spend the most time talking about today is how dryland trains more efficient, coordinated, and powerful muscle contractions. That's kind of what is usually termed as athleticism. If you ever see basketball players, football players, they're very athletic, right? They can move fast, they move in a very coordinated manner. And that's something that swimmers, with all the yardage we put in and being in the water and not on land, we kind of lose that. So trying to get that back a little bit through dryland training might be the most helpful way dryland helps us in the water. Before we get to talking about the weight room and all the different training exercises, let's just start as if you were a little kid coming up through the ranks in a swim program. How would dryland look like for kids, and what's the goal here? So on the right here is, as promised, a big complicated picture of how your brain works and how it communicates to muscles and skin and such and those kind of things. So this motor cortex, this is up here in the brain. This is what starts a motion. So you want to do butterfly, freestyle, jumping, walking. It starts up here in the motor cortex, and it sends a signal down to the muscles and tells them to do something. And this is called the motor pattern. A motor pattern is just an instruction manual of what you're supposed to be doing with your muscles. So there's a motor pattern for butterfly, there's a motor pattern for walking, all kinds of things. And it's an instruction of what's supposed to happen. And when the muscles start doing those things, you have sensations that feed the brain, that send signals up and tell the brain what is happening, which is often very different. So you have places like the thalamus and the cerebellum, if you see here the motor pattern, it actually sends a signal to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum's job is to compare what was supposed to happen with what actually is happening. And then it sends its own signals to this processing center called the basal ganglia, which sends signals back to the motor cortex with corrected instructions on what should happen. And then the cycle all repeats itself, and it goes around and around in a circle. The big takeaway here is not to understand what all these different parts do. It's just to illustrate how much communication there is between the brain, the muscles, the nerves, the sensory signals. And in kids, all of this is underdeveloped. That's why they look so awkward when they swim, when they run, when they just look like they can't really control themselves as well as an adult. The goal for kid dryland is to improve these connections and improve these lines of communication. And really the best way to do that is to have very specific exercises like push-ups, squats, sit-ups, something where they just have to do one motion absolutely perfectly. And over time, that'll help build these connections. It'll help build body awareness like we talked about. And hopefully that'll translate into the water when you're trying to teach them a new technique or a new stroke, that when they can control their bodies better, then they can learn more advanced techniques. And for little kids, again, don't be afraid to let dryland be more about fun and games and building a team culture. And if you can do that when they're young, then that's going to carry on to when they're older, and that way when training gets really tough, they can handle it. The concept of specificity of training has been around for a very long time, decades, in the exercise science world. And when it comes to dryland training, it's probably the most important concept that you should take away from this talk. Specificity of training really comes down to, if you want to improve in something, you have to do it. If you want to get better at running, you have to run. If you want to get better at squats, you have to squat. If you want to get better at butterfly, you have to do butterfly. And the more specific your training is to that motion or activity, the more it's going to improve. One of my favorite research studies that was ever done tried to test the specificity of training, and it kind of illustrates just how much the body adapts to a certain exercise. So what they did was they took a group of people, and on day one, they tested their squatting ability, their leg press ability, and their leg extension. So for those who don't know, squats are kind of where you have the bar on your back and you're going up and down. Leg press is a machine that's locked in, and you kind of sit laying back and you push it up with your legs only. And then a leg extension machine is where you're sitting on a chair kind of thing, and you've got a roller on your feet and you kick it out, kind of like think of it as a dolphin kicking motion. So they're all leg oriented exercises, but they're just a little bit different. So on day one, they tested their squat, leg press, and leg extension, how good. And so they got a baseline number for each of these people. And then for 6 weeks, they only trained squatting. They didn't do leg press, they didn't do leg extensions for 6 weeks. But squats are considered overall, full body exercise, legs and all, very leg heavy. So it should improve these other two exercises. After 6 weeks, they retested how well they could squat, leg press, and leg extend. Not surprisingly, their squats improved, let's say, 100%. The numbers don't really matter, it's just the concepts behind the numbers. So the squats improved the most. The leg press, surprisingly, only improved about 50%. So it got a little bit better, but not nearly as good as the squats. And you would think that leg press would improve at least as much as squatting. It's almost the same motion. And the most surprising thing, the leg extensions actually didn't improve at all. Statistically insignificant improvement in leg extensions. So I like this study because it really illustrates how specific you have to be in order to get the improvements you want in the water. And I think a lot of swimming dryland focuses on Olympic lifts and motions that you just don't see in the water. And so if you don't see it in the water and you're not practicing it on land, I doubt it's ever going to improve all that much. So, Big Kid Dryland. We tried to condense things into 4 main swimming motions, and the 4 we came up with are jumping, pulling, pushing, and some abdominals. And we'll go through some variations on each of these a little bit later. And we wanted to focus in on 4 different training zones. There's circuit training, strength, power, and speed. So let's go through all these one by one. Circuit training is what it sounds like. You have a group of exercises that you rotate through and in a circuit kind of fashion, and one after another: squats, pull-ups, bench press, sit-ups. Usually it's done at very light weight, and you don't really go for a certain number of reps. It's more for time, so 30 seconds on each exercise, and then you switch to the next one. Circuit training is the only type of dryland training that improves VO2 max. So what's VO2 max? That's the maximum number of oxygen molecules that your body can consume and use in its energy development. VO2 max is a big component of endurance ability. It's not everything, but it's a big part of it. And a large part of it has to do with how well your heart can pump and how big it is. And the reason I think circuit training helps VO2 max is that it forces the heart to pump to all different muscle groups at the same time, which is a big struggle because you actually don't have enough blood in your body to send everywhere at the same time. So because you're challenging the heart to send it to so many different places, it actually has to pump faster and harder and to get the blood where it needs to go, and that can improve VO2 max. Really, for us, circuit training is going to be a time to focus on building a base kind of without overdoing it. Focus on good technique, general fitness for lifting. It's really good for like early in the season when everyone's just kind of a little out of shape, or for young swimmers where you want to keep things moving and keep them active. But this is a good kind of starting point for dryland. Here's some examples of circuits that you can do. So you could, if you're going to train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you could do Monday, you could do a circuit of squats and Russian twists, rows, on, and then every day of the week it kind of changes up just a little bit to keep things fresh. And the idea here is you're switching from, we're back to those 4 swimming motions. We're training, jumping, abs, pulling, abs, pushing, abs, a lot of ab work here. But you don't want to go from like squats to dumbbell jumps to box jumps. You don't want everything to be part of, leg heavy. You want to jump from legs to arms to abs and kind of bounce around between the 4 swimming motions and try to keep the exercises different every time they change from one circuit to another. So once we kind of have our dryland base made through circuit training, then we can start focusing on the other 3 training zones, which are like strength, power, and speed. And each of these has a specific focus in mind, and it helps feed into the next training zone below it. So strength, we'll go through it, feeds into power, which feeds into speed. So let's go through these one at a time and see what they look like and what they actually improve in your body. Strength is defined by the maximum weight you could pick up or the maximum force you can produce just 1 or 2 times. It's kind of easier to go through this concept with an example. Let's say your bicep muscle is made up of 100 motor units or muscle fibers. For now, these are kind of interchangeable words, but when you want to scratch your nose and you bring your arm up to your nose, you're not activating all 100 fibers. If you did that, you'd end up producing the maximum amount of strength in that muscle and you'd punch yourself in the face. So in order for your body to use just the amount of strength required, it only turns on a few muscle fibers at a time. And if more and more strength is required, if you go from scratching your nose to curling 100 pounds, then it starts activating more and more fibers to create that extra strength. This is all controlled through the nerves. Usually the muscles are actively turned off by nerves. They're kind of suppressed. And strength training helps release that suppression. It helps desensitize the nerves so that you can recruit, that's the technical term, recruit more muscle fibers, more motor units to produce more strength. So it's in the same, of those same 100 muscle fibers, you can actually get a lot more strength if you train to desensitize those nerves. And that's our goal with strength training. So we practice lifting heavy weights for just 1 or 2 reps, lots and lots of rest. And our goal is to go from recruiting, let's say in circuit training, these are just kind of arbitrary numbers. It'd be difficult to actually test this in real life, but it goes from, you can unlock this muscle potential from recruiting 50% to recruiting 100% is the goal. And that way, with the same exact muscle mass, you can produce a lot more strength. You can pick up a lot more weight. You can make a lot more force without actually adding a lot of mass. And so that's what strength training is trying to develop, is desensitizing those nerves and allow you to take advantage of more with less. Before moving on to the different exercises you could potentially do for strength training of our 4 swimming motions, I just wanted to say you don't actually have to max out. That's why this is max out-ish. Remember that we're swimmers first, not weightlifters. The goal, you don't have to go to failure. You don't have to put on so much weight where you're spending 10 seconds trying to lift it and struggling the whole way. You can keep things in a safe range, or use machines to keep things safer, or spotters to keep the weights moving. But it's just the concept here that we're after, not the actual result. So you want to go heavy and keep the reps real low, but you don't actually have to go to failure and go to that point. Just trying to get the concept of it in is going to be good enough. So here are our swimming motions: jumping, pulling, pushing, and here are some different exercises for each of these that you can consider as far as strength exercises go. This is just opinion here, but here's kind of the ideal exercise for each of these swimming motions, and then there are other variations that you can consider depending on how experienced you are with weightlifting, what kind of equipment you have available, or if you don't have any equipment available but you still want to follow this concept. For instance, for jumping exercise, barbell squatting is what I would say is the ideal, but if you don't want to spend the time setting up a big squat rack, or you don't have the experience with weightlifting squats, you can just do dumbbell squats. You do the leg press, which is a great exercise, super safe, and just on a machine. So there's a lot of different variations, and you don't have to be locked into just one thing. So these are actually all individual videos, just like 45 seconds, 1 minute videos on different, kind of explaining these different exercises and things to focus on, and different variations like seated squats or sumo squats. I'm not going to play them during this PowerPoint, but you can download this PowerPoint off the website, and you can play them at home and kind of go through them. And my suggestion is, if you choose 1 or 2 of these and focus on those all season and try to get good at just those few exercises instead of trying to do all of them at the same time during a season, and try to watch your swimmers improve week to week at these different exercises. Videos on pulling, for the pulling motion, and then we have some variations on pushing variations. And just a quick comment, one of my favorite things to do in Dryland is to add these like rubber bands. And what this does is as you push up and go up higher, the band stretches and it creates more and more resistance. So at the top of the push-up, for instance, or squat or whatever, you're actually lifting more weight than you are at the bottom. And that's actually, I think that's a good concept, because as muscles contract, they actually become stronger. And you want to be able to teach them to contract harder and harder and to accelerate their contraction. And the rubber band is kind of a nice way to do that. Once we've developed good recruitment ability with strength training, we can move on to power training. And the issue with strength training is that, you know, it'll get us to that 100% maximum recruitment line that we want, but it's not necessarily going to do it very quickly. If you're maxing out a squat and it takes you 5 seconds to go from the bottom to the top, that's good for muscle recruitment and developing strength, but you're not necessarily developing that power early, and it's just taking too long. It's not mimicking exactly what's going on in the water. You don't want to be on the blocks and take 5 seconds to jump off of it. You want all that energy and all that recruitment to happen as early as possible. And that's where we start developing that with power. So power training, we're definitely going down on the heaviness of the weights, medium kind of weights, still keeping the reps low. And the big focus here is moving the weight as fast as possible. We don't want things to move slowly. And ideally, what we're going to start adding into these exercises is a lift-off or a follow-through motion. So, like I mentioned before, we don't want, as the lift progresses, let's say squatting, as you're coming up in a squat, your muscles actually are actively slowing down when you get to the top of the motion, because your body doesn't want to jump off the floor with 100 pounds on its back. So, and that's not exactly mimicking what we're going to do in the water. We want to be able to push and accelerate the motion all the way through the lift. So having a follow through on a lot of these is going to be really beneficial. Here's another list of ideal and variation exercises for each of our swimming focuses. So like we progressed from barbell squats, which are really heavy and focusing on strength, to dumbbell jumps, and we'll have a video here later on. But starting to get that weighted jumping motion is going to be really key. And actually, if you look at the science, power exercise, or the other name is ballistics, things like dumbbell jumping was proven to improve vertical, like improving your vertical better than straight weightlifting or even plyometrics like body weight exercises, jumping. So, and I think as far as swimming is concerned, power exercises might be the most beneficial to swimmers, because in the water we don't just have to lift or push against our body weight, we have to push against the water, which is very heavy, and it acts like added weight. So when you're jumping off the wall on a flip turn or an open turn, it's almost like you're not just trying to move your body weight, but you're trying to move the weight of the water around you as well. So these exercises might end up being the most important aspect of swimming dryland that we talk about. So if you have to sacrifice some of the other things and focus on these, if you're limited on time or space or equipment, I would suggest focusing on these kinds of exercises as much as possible. So here's another set of videos showing just some other variations of like jump variations, pulling, pushing variations. When it comes to power pushing, I kind of ran out of ideas. So if you guys can come up with some things, please send it my way, and we'll include it in later versions of the video. Finally, we can move on to speed training, which is really just trying to mimic the race as closely as possible. We're going to get rid of almost all the weight, focus on just body weight type exercises, and we're trying to get the maximum speed out of every motion. Still just doing a few reps, 3 to 6. Remember that in Dryland, we don't want to break down, we don't want to spend all of our muscle fuel and sugar jumping around and doing pull-ups. We want to focus on training the nerves rather than the muscles, and we don't want Dryland to affect what we do in the water, so just a reminder on that. And when we get to speed exercises, we really want to focus on concentric only exercises. So what that means is, to every lifting motion, there's two aspects. There's the down motion, so taking squats for example, when you go from standing to squatting down, that down motion is called eccentric. It's the eccentric part of the motion. And when you start going up, that's the concentric motion. So concentric, contracting, moving the weight in the direction you want it. When we get to speed exercises, we want to focus more on concentric, up-only type motions and get rid of the eccentric things. The reason is, eccentric motions tend to cause a lot more muscle damage, and they can promote muscle size, like the actual growth of the muscles. That's not necessarily what we want from Dryland. And ideally, you could do concentric only exercises throughout all of the different training modalities, the strength, the power, circuit training. It's a little more difficult to implement. There's some examples in those videos before, but at least when we get to speed, we really want to make this a priority. Here are the different exercises you can do. As you can see, the list is starting to get shorter and shorter as we move on, but that's okay. Just a couple comments. I like box jumping and long jumping for these kind of jumping exercises, and when you do them, make sure that you start in the position that you're going to be in, like on the blocks or in the water. I see a lot of swimmers and coaches, they do box jumps standing up and then they hop onto the box. That's not really mimicking what you're doing in the water or in a race. So always try to be thinking, how can I mimic the race as much as possible? And focus on building those techniques on land, and they should transfer to the race, the actual race. Again, the creative juices were starting to run dry, so if you can come up with some more pushing variations, I'd love to hear about them. I know earlier we talked about the 4 swimming motions, and that included abs as one of those, and we haven't really talked about them much because the abs are a little bit different than the other activities. These guys aren't really producing a motion per se, but instead they're kind of connecting the arms and the legs and coordinating the whole body to produce effective, efficient motions and power in the water. Just to be on my soapbox a little bit, the word core I'm not a huge fan of. It just seems vague, and people use it as a buzzword a lot of times, and I think it just means different things to different people. It ends up meaning whatever you want it to mean. In anatomy class, I never really learned about the core muscle. There was always, external obliques and semispinalis, but core just kind of seems out there for me. Anyway, off my soapbox. When I think of abs, I try to distinguish them between upper abs, lower abs, and twisty abs. So your upper abs are bringing your chest forward, like sit-ups, crunches. Your lower abs are bringing your legs and pelvis upwards, leg raises, flutter kicks. And then twisty abs are like your Russian twists, window wipers, things that control side-to-side motions. So if you can base your ab training around, just make it more specific, more thoughtful. I think the kids will buy into it more and try harder when you actually have ab workouts. This is just a picture of wheelbarrow races, something that we like to do with the kids, because it's kind of puts you in that swimming motion with your head down and your arms doing most of the work. One thing you'll notice if you do it for the first time with kids, is that their hips will start rocking back and forth, and they start wiggling side to side instead of keeping their body aligned and straight. So this is kind of a neat way to get them on land, where you can actually instruct them to tell them how to keep everything stable while they're trying to race with their arms and their head down. So here are some more variation. I didn't want to go through all the typical, sit-ups, bicycles. I wanted to go through some more maybe out-of-the-box ab workouts. A couple things that maybe would be different are these reverse hypers, where you bring your legs up, and it's almost like the upward motion of a dolphin kick. Just some different things to try and practice. All right, let's move on to flexibility training. And I know coaches always bug swimmers to stretch more, and I know that swimmers rarely ever do it. And if they do it, it's always at the wrong time, at a big meet or during taper, and sometimes that can cause more problems than it solves. So I just wanted to maybe go through flexibility and the different versions and types, and maybe that'll convince all of us to do a little bit better at giving more time towards flexibility training. So let's start with kind of the natural habitat of muscle, bones, connective tissue. So down here at the base you have bones, and where two bones meet is a joint, and around this joint and bones you have muscles. Muscles connect via tendon, so tendons are a muscle to bone connection, and it always crosses a joint. Because the whole point of muscles is to bring two bones closer together, or to rotate joints around each other, so you have to have a tendon that goes across it. Around the muscle is fascia. Fascia is kind of like a very thick, hard casing around muscles and different compartments of the body. Then you have connective tissue. This can be collagen, fat. It's kind of the in-between stuff that fills your limbs out. And then on top, around all of that, you have skin. And all of these contribute to flexibility or stiffness, the opposite of flexibility. So what is flexibility actually mean? So there's two different types. There's static flexibility, and not static stretching. I mean flexibility, which is the maximum range of motion of a joint. So flexibility is always talking about a joint. How much can you actually move it? And what's the maximum range of motion? And this is going to be dictated by all these components that we talked about. The bones, which are connected by ligaments, which I didn't draw in here. These tendons, the connective tissue, even the skin. All of these are going to affect your range of motion. Secondly, there's something that most people don't talk about, which is called dynamic flexibility. Dynamic flexibility is the stiffness of a joint. So comparing like swimmers and weightlifters, for instance, they might be able to move their joints to the same maximum range of motion, but for a swimmer who's more dynamically flexible, they might be able to reach that range of motion a lot easier, or with a lot less force. So let's say this is a knee. If you want to bend this bone all the way back, stretching your knee, stretching your quad, a weightlifter might have to put 100 pounds of force to get his joint to go to the right, to the end of its range of motion, whereas a swimmer will just have to put in like 20 pounds of force. I'm just making numbers up just to illustrate. So the difference in how much force it takes to move a joint, that's dynamic flexibility. And I think swimmers actually benefit a lot more from dynamic flexibility. If you ever watch Olympians underwater and they're doing their dolphin kick or their butterfly, they just look like loose rubber bands, and that's kind of what we want to accomplish. And it might be even more important than just regular static flexibility. So what actually changes when we stretch? What are we doing to the muscles, the connective tissues, all of that? So in any like limb, in your legs, arms, connective tissue is actually up to 30% of the mass of that limb, which is a huge amount. And if you don't train it and you don't focus on it, it'll never change. Luckily, even connective tissue, bones, tendons, everything in your body is alive, and it's continually remodeling and reshaping itself based on the demands that you put it through. So, let's say you spend a lot of time rolling or stretching, all this messy connective tissue can kind of remodel and reorient to where it's in a position where it's more flexible and allows more dynamic flexibility, more looseness, like we talked about. Another big aspect of flexibility is the muscle itself. So the muscle can protect joints from moving very much depending on how spastic it is, how much tone is in that muscle. And the specific receptor or the specific controller of this spasticity is called the Golgi tendon organ. So this guy is sensing how long the muscle actually is, and it controls that like baseline tone and spasticity. And it's located inside the tendon, this green line here. And so it always wants to control how long that tendon is, and it gives feedback to the muscle to tell it how spastic to be. So during dryland, for instance, you cause a lot of damage to the muscle, to the connective tissue, to these tendons, and the body wants to protect itself from further damage. And so the Golgi tendon kind of freaks out and it says, hey, you need to stop moving this joint, and it tightens down the muscle. It makes the muscle more spastic, and it makes your joints more stiff. And of course, if you're stiff, then you've lost flexibility. The goal of stretching is to recalibrate the Golgi tendon and to tell it that everything's okay and you can relax. And stretching actually can help that organ relax and recalibrate. And it takes about 10 seconds of continuous stretching to actually get it to change its mind and recalibrate. So here's kind of so after dryland workout, things might be spastic and tightened down, and then with stretching, you can return it back to a normal level. So most of us actually know how to stretch. It's pretty simple. You bend a muscle or a joint to a point where your muscles feel like they're stretching, and then you hold it for a little while, and hopefully if you do that enough, things will become more flexible. And that's generally true, but wanted to just point out a couple different things and maybe some out-of-the-box stretching modalities that you may never have heard about. So just in general, to really get the benefit of stretching, you have to do a muscle group 2 to 3 times a week for, holding, 2 to 3 different stretches for 30 seconds at least. And it's a lot of time. If you do this right for every muscle group every day or every week, it's going to take a lot of time to do. But if you kind of multitask, and if you're watching TV or doing homework, reading a book, you can stretch at the same time that you do other things. So if you time it right, you shouldn't have to actually spend any extra time focusing on this. You can just add it to your daily routine. So static stretching, that's kind of what we normally think of as stretching, stretch and hold. There's ballistic stretching, which is kind of bouncing motions. Generally, that's not recommended because it can cause a lot more damage and injury. You can pull muscles this way. So on land, maybe avoid ballistic stretching, but I just wanted to point out that we do it every day with fins. Fins can help stretch your ankles out, and it's kind of a form of ballistic stretching. So I just thought it was interesting and I'd mention. The last form of stretching, which I don't think many people do, this is mostly found in physical therapy sessions, and it's called PNF stretching, or PNF stands for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, which is a huge word, a huge group of words, but PNF will be fine. So PNF, this is what's shown here on the right. Basically, you start with stretching, 5-10 seconds, and then against the stretch, you contract the muscle the opposite direction. And you can do this yourself like it's pictured here, or you can have somebody pushing against your heel, and you try to push down against them, and it's only for a few seconds, and then you go straight back into the relaxed phase, and you try to stretch more. And what you'll notice is that every time you contract and then relax, contract and relax, your muscles will sort of gain all this flexibility that you were struggling to achieve before. So you might start kind of upright like this, and then by the end you might have 10-15 extra degrees of stretching. And the way this works is you're tricking this Golgi tendon organ that we talked about earlier. By contracting against a stretch, you're further recalibrating this sensor and you're tricking it into thinking that, hey, you should even relax even more, and it does. So PNF stretching can be extremely effective, very powerful, but I would just be careful. Anytime you're stretching a muscle well past what it's used to in its range of motion, it's going to cause more damage and more soreness. And so this is something you want to be consistent about. You don't want to do it just every once in a while, or at the end of the season, you're during taper. You don't want to do this during taper for the first time. And even during taper, I would say taper this type of stretching. You want to improve your range of motion, improve your flexibility throughout the season, and then once you start getting to taper time, start tapering off these kind of stretches as well. Okay, periodization. So periodization is a concept where you're trying to structure your season plan. If you've ever heard of microcycles, macrocycles, season plans, that's different words for the same concept, periodization. So we wanted to do something on day one, a different thing on day two, and we're trying to structure things in a way where it's kind of logical and feeds into each other. This big diagram is just an example, a guideline. I think if anybody ever tells you that they know exactly how to periodize Dryland specifically, that's a stretch, because everybody's going to be different. Every team is going to have different equipment. Every person has different events that they're focusing on. There are different ages. There's so many different variables. There's no way to say this is the correct way to schedule Dryland, and different ways are wrong. So periodization is really just a matter of experimentation, figuring out what exercises work, how they work with your other training, like in-water training, how they work during the season. But we can at least go through this suggested or guideline example, and you can take it in any direction you like. So the way to read this big chart here is you want to start here in the left upper corner, and every kind of group of lines is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, so of the week. So let's say this is like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, something like that. So for the first 2 to 4 weeks, we're going to focus on circuit training. So remember, we want to build a base, practice our Dryland exercises at low weights with good technique. We want to develop good endurance with VO2 max, improving things. So you do circuit exercise. Day 1, you're going to maybe do this circuit. Day 2, you'll do this circuit. Day 3, day 4. And you go through this for a few weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, just to build a base and get ready for the next phase. Then we can get into week 5 here, and this is day 1 of week 5, day 2 of week 5, day 3, day 4. And this is just an example again. So you do 1 week through of these strength exercises. So everything here is very low reps, high weight. Remember, we don't want to fail. We just want to feel like it's heavy, and then stop. And then the next week we go to power. So we feed our maximum recruitment and strength that we developed this week into the power. So we want early recruitment, we want acceleration of exercises, we want acceleration of muscle contraction. And again, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And then once we've developed some power, then we feed it into speed on the 3rd week, or in this case, week 7. Box jumps, med ball throws, long jumps, day 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, most likely by week 7, your season's not over. So you can return back to week 5 and repeat the cycle. Repeat all these 3 weeks over and over, and continually improving on every exercise that you do throughout the season. And then once you get to the end of your season, you're about 2 weeks away from your major competition, then you want to start tapering. And really the taper is the same thing as speed, but just a lot less volume. And that's what taper should always be. It should always be the same intensity or more intensity, but a lot less volume. So here, box jumps, we went from 10 to 12 sets to just 2 to 4. And even the reps come down and the rest goes up. So here we're focusing on just maintaining the nerve teaching, the nerve coordination, but trying not to damage the muscles or spend a lot of energy actually doing it. And every day there's some stretching involved, and when it comes to taper, I just let swimmers have some freedom and do their favorite stretches. And usually taper, here it's suggested 2 weeks, but whatever you feel is right. And again, this is just one example of how to structure Dryland. You could do it totally different. So another example would be, let's say you do your circuit training and you're past your base building phase. Another way is to treat strength as day 1, power is day 2, and speed is day 3 throughout the week. So you could do, so this up here, this box could be all 1 week, and then this could be week 2, week 3 down here, and week 4. And then you can repeat that monthly cycle before you move on to taper. So it just kind of depends where you're at in your season, what kind of swimmers you have, what kind of equipment you've got. But it's always, that's what makes Dryland and swimming and coaching and training fun, is it's always an experiment, and you can always try new things and see what works best for you and your team. So thanks very much for listening to me talk for I don't know how long. Hopefully you learned a couple things and you can take it to your next training session, and just try to be open-minded and go back to the basics. If you're ever confused about what people are talking about, why one person says they have the right answer, another person says they have the right answer, and none of them seem to fit together, it probably means that everyone's making it up as they go along. So the more you can focus on fundamentals and explain it to your team and have a focused goal and a strategy for how you're trying to attain that goal, then that's going to create the most effective workouts for you. Thanks.